Welcome back to the deep dive. I've been looking forward to this one. Today, we're going deep on the Apostle Paul, specifically his missionary journeys.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
And to help us navigate this, we've got Arthur F. Glasser as our guide. He's got a pretty impressive resume, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Dean Emeritus, senior professor at Fuller Theological Seminary,
Wow.
missionary experience in China,
No kidding.
edited the journal Missiology. The guy really knows his stuff. And he brings this really interesting blend of academic rigor, like you said, and actual on-the-ground experience to this topic.
Yeah, I'm really excited to pick his brain, so to speak, through his writing.
Well, and one of the things that Glasser really emphasizes is the sheer magnitude of Paul's story. This guy Saul, who was like the ultimate persecutor of the early Christians.
I totally committed to stamping them out.
And then he becomes Paul. And not just a believer, but like the architect of so much of the church as we know it today, especially when you think about the spread of Christianity beyond its Jewish roots.
It's a huge transformation.
Astounding, really. And the missionary movement he sparked, it's still going strong. I mean, wow.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what was going through his head.
Totally. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is unpack the heart of Paul's mission, what made it tick. And we're going to do that by leaning on Glasser's analysis. I think you're going to find some surprising stuff in there.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see where this goes. Let's start with that turning point, Saul becoming Paul. What led to that dramatic shift?
Well, before he was Paul, like we were saying, he was this rabid persecutor. Glasser doesn't mince words about it.
No, not at all. I mean, think about it. Acts chapter 8, he's right there giving his approval to Stephen's stoning.
Brutal. That's hardcore opposition. And then, bam, everything changes. This encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, it's like a lightning strike.
It's almost too much to wrap your head around, right?
Yeah, it's like, how do you go from that level of animosity to, well, everything that comes after? It really highlights the power of this encounter. Paul himself, years later, writing to the Philippians, it obviously stuck with him. It wasn't just some passing phase.
No, it was the defining moment. And Glasser makes his point, it wasn't just about Paul's own personal salvation. This experience was directly tied to his calling to become a missionary. Like, those two things were inseparable.
Absolutely, like intertwined from the start.
Glasser even quotes Paul from Galatians chapter 1. Paul says, God revealed his son to me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles.
And what's even more amazing is that it wasn't just go and tell people about Jesus. It was much more specific than that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Glasser points to Acts chapter 26, verse 18. Jesus lays it all out for Paul. Open their eyes, turn them from darkness to light, from Satan's authority to God.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about believing, it's about a complete shift in allegiance.
Exactly. It's a whole reorientation, receiving forgiveness of sins, being sanctified by faith in Jesus. It's a whole package.
That's fascinating. So Paul was given a who, where, and how for his mission.
Yeah.
It wasn't just this nebulous idea of spreading the good news.
Right. Super specific instructions. And he really took it to heart. Like, this heavenly vision, as he calls it later in Acts, became his driving force. This wasn't some fleeting moment for him. It was everything. From silencing the message of Jesus to devoting his life to shouting it from the rooftops.
The intensity of that shift is incredible.
Totally. So with all that as backdrop, we start to see this predominantly Gentile church emerge in Antioch. We read about it in Acts chapter 11. And Glasser sees this as a major turning point,
Yeah.
This becomes the springboard for spreading the message westward out into the Mediterranean world. And this church was different.
In what way?
Well, they weren't like those old school religious institutions,
Right, much more organic.
Exactly. Glasser describes these house churches full of life, super dynamic.
I bet Barnabas and Paul were instrumental in shaping that environment.
Oh, for sure. And this church was cosmopolitan,
Yeah.
People from all walks of life, different backgrounds.
Kind of a melting pot.
Yeah. Evangelistic, too, spreading their faith. They had a solid grasp of the teachings and were incredibly generous. And in Acts chapter 13, we see them seeking God's guidance through worship and fasting.
They were serious about their faith. So they had this thriving community, but they weren't content to stay put. They were bumping up against all these barriers, geographical, cultural, linguistic.
Yeah, and they knew that their casual near-neighbor approach wasn't going to cut it if they wanted to reach people further afield.
It's like they knew they were onto something big, but needed a new strategy to make it work.
Exactly. So they turned to prayer and fasting, seeking direction.
Smart move.
And what happens next, according to Glasser, is a pivotal moment. It's like the birth of foreign missions as we know it.
Wow, that's huge.
The Holy Spirit leads them to commission Barnabas and Saul, sending them off specifically for this purpose. Sent them off. That's the language used in Acts.
So this was more than just, hey, go spread the word. This was a deliberate, Spirit-led sending.
Right. And this leads Glasser to make a really interesting point about missionary sending, He says that the New Testament shows us two valid models. You have the local church sending missionaries, like in Antioch, but you also have these self-directed missionary bands, like Paul's team.
Interesting.
So he pushes back on this idea that the local assembly is the only legitimate way to send missionaries.
That's thought-provoking. So Paul and his team, they had a lot of autonomy, right?
A lot. Glasser points out they were mostly self-sufficient. Financially, they handled their own recruitment, training, even spiritual accountability within their group. They saw themselves as God's envoys, constantly crossing borders, both physical and spiritual.
That's a great image. So what did they actually do on these journeys?
Well, Glasser outlines it in Acts chapter 14. They were very strategic, preaching the gospel, making disciples, not just converts, but people who are following Jesus.
Right.
And then bringing those new believers together, forming congregations.
Establishing those local expressions of the church.
Exactly. Not just individual conversions, but building up the body of Christ. Then, after each journey, they'd go back to Antioch, report on their progress, how God had opened doors for the Gentiles.
So let's dive into the specifics of Paul's approach. Glasser identifies two main objectives that guided his initial efforts, especially in those early years.
Okay, I'm listening.
The first was to make a point of visiting Jewish synagogues, starting in Asia Minor. Paul himself said, to the Jew first, in Romans.
Yeah, it makes sense to start where there's already a foundation of monotheism, a familiarity with the scriptures.
Right, but what's interesting is what Glasser says about the double purpose of these visits.
Oh, I like where this is going.
It wasn't just about reaching the Jewish communities, it was also about connecting with the God-fearers. Gentiles who were drawn to Jewish ethics, the idea of one God.
Ah, I see. Like they were already primed for the message.
Exactly. They were already on a spiritual journey. And as Glasser reminds us, the Jewish people already had this rich heritage, covenants, the law, the promises.
It's not like Paul was starting from scratch with them.
Right. And there's another strategic element here. Paul hoped that seeing the Gentiles embrace the gospel would provoke jealousy among the Jews.
Kind of like, hey, look what you're missing out on.
Yeah, exactly. He even mentions it in Romans.
Interesting.
Glasser also points out that the first century was a time of active Jewish missionary work. So there was this existing movement of people exploring monotheism. It's like Paul was tapping into that current, connecting with those God-fearers who were already seeking.
So smart.
It's even mentioned in Acts chapter 19. Luke says, all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks.
Wow, talk about widespread impact. Okay, so we've got the synagogue visits. What's the second objective?
The second objective was about planting messianic synagogues, as Glasser calls them, where Jewish folks were receptive to Jesus as Messiah, and also establishing Gentile congregations where the majority weren't Jewish.
Ah, tailoring the approach to fit the audience. That's very forward-thinking.
Yeah, he wasn't trying to force a one-size-fits-all model. Paul adapted his approach to connect with people where they were at, whether they were coming from a Jewish or Gentile background.
Really smart. So this brings us to this crucial link between church and mission in Paul's thinking.
Yeah, Glasser really dives into this.
I mean, Paul saw the church as absolutely essential for mission to succeed. Like he says in 1 Timothy, I was appointed a preacher, apostle, and teacher of the Gentiles.
It was all about building up the church.
Totally. Glasser highlights Paul's conviction that the church's core task was to proclaim the gospel, to bring new believers into this vibrant community, and to keep multiplying those local congregations.
And the relationship between Paul's missionary teams and these new churches was so important to him.
Oh, yeah. He was all about fostering unity. Like in Romans chapter 15, we see him collecting financial support from the Gentile churches to help the Jewish believers in Jerusalem.
He really wanted to show that unity, just like Jesus prayed for in John 17.
Powerful stuff. And Glasser also emphasizes that Paul didn't view these churches as just passive recipients. He taught them that they, too, were sent by God,
Oh, that's interesting. Like, they inherited that missionary calling.
Exactly. They had to reach beyond their own communities, bring the message of Christ's kingdom to the wider world. And Paul's letter to the Roman church, Glasser uses that as this prime example of his strategy.
Okay, how so?
Well, he sees it as Paul's way of prepping Rome to become this second Antioch, like a central hub for future missions, specifically reaching Spain and the Western Mediterranean.
Ah, I see. And by the time he wrote to them, Paul says in Romans chapter 15 that he felt they'd pretty much covered the region from Jerusalem to Illyricum.
So Rome was the next logical step. And his letter was strategic. It was about getting those Roman believers ready to play their part, providing experienced personnel, financial backing, prayer support.
He was preparing them for a bigger role, helping them understand their identity as both recipients and senders of the gospel.
Precisely. Glasser argues that Paul wanted them to feel that connection between their local faith and this global mission. It was all part of this big picture, the gospel reaching every corner of the world, just like Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24.
We can't talk about Paul's missionary work without addressing the suffering he went through.
Oh man, it's a huge part of his story. Glasso calls it the strategy of suffering.
It's intense. I mean, even at the very beginning, Acts chapter 9, Jesus tells Ananias that Paul will suffer greatly for his name.
And Paul didn't just endure it, he embraced it, like it was part of his calling. Glasser points to that passage in 1 Corinthians where he talks about becoming all things to all people.
Right. Total commitment.
Paul was all in, co-laboring with Christ, even when it meant sacrifice. And he was so aware of the spiritual battles going on behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, he talks about Satan and these other spiritual forces all the time in his letters.
Yeah, he knew there were powers working against the gospel. And while he believed they were ultimately defeated by Christ on the cross, they were still active, trying to thwart God's plan.
They weren't just metaphors for Paul. So how did he fight back?
Glasser says it was through faith, love, prayer, obedience to God, and through suffering. Like he says in 1 Thessalonians, we're appointed unto afflictions.
Wow.
And Glasser clarifies that when Paul talks about Christ's afflictions, he's not saying Jesus' sacrifice on the cross wasn't enough.
Right.
He's talking about the hardships, the exhaustion, the hostility, the spiritual battles that come with being a servant of Christ. It's the cost of discipleship, especially when you're on the front lines of spreading the gospel.
It's this constant spiritual conflict, the battle against the forces that are trying to stop God's mission, whether it's in religion or ideas or morality or even politics.
It's everywhere. And Glasser ends by emphasizing Paul's call to action, Resist those forces. Put on the whole armor of God, like it says in Ephesians chapter 6.
So looking back at Glasser's analysis, it's amazing how comprehensive Paul's missionary approach was. That radical personal transformation, the clear sense of calling.
The strategic use of these apostolic bands to reach both Jews and Gentiles, the essential role of local churches, and then that undeniable reality of suffering, it's all connected.
It's really powerful stuff.
And it makes you think, as we wrap this up, how do you see the relationship between your own church community and the wider world today? What are the modern-day frontiers for the gospel?
That's a great question.
And how can Paul's strategies, his understanding of spiritual warfare, how can that guide us as we engage with those frontiers? It's definitely something to chew on.
A lot to think about. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the missionary work of the Apostle Paul with Arthur F. Glasser as our guide.
This was a good one.
Until next time, keep exploring.